Welcome to Threads of Truth, the podcast, where real-life mysteries meet internet speculation. Today we're examining a century-old crime that continues to haunt investigators, a remote farmhouse, 6 brutal murders, and disturbing evidence suggesting the killer remained inside the home after the family was dead.
It's just, it's one of those cases that completely gets under your skin.
It really does,
Yeah.
because, imagine waking up, right? You walk into a cozy kitchen, make a pot of coffee, maybe cut a thick slice of fresh bread.
Yeah.
The fire in the oven is warm.
Yeah.
The farm dog is fed. He's tied up outside. It just feels like a perfectly normal, quiet morning out in the countryside.
Right.
Except the home isn't yours. And the reason it's so quiet is that you violently murdered the owners the night before. And their bodies are stacked just a few feet away in the barn.
It's the ultimate subversion of what we think of as a home invasion.
Exactly.
When you picture a home invasion, you picture panic, a shattered window, a chaotic struggle.
Somebody running away.
Right. The perpetrator fleeing into the night before the police arrive. But Hinterkaifeck completely shatters that profile. This wasn't some sudden, frenzied strike. This was a slow, creeping occupation.
Yeah.
And to truly understand how terrifying this is, you really have to place yourself in the geographic reality of 1922 Bavaria. We are talking about a farmstead located roughly 70 kilometers north of Munich. But culturally and geographically, it might as well have been on the moon.
Right. The isolation here is sort of the foundation of the entire mystery. If you were standing at the front door of the Hinterkaifeck farmhouse back then, you wouldn't see, friendly neighbors or a bustling town square.
No, not at all.
You'd see the edge of a dense, freezing Bavarian forest, the shadows of the tree line literally creeping right up to the property. It's the kind of environment where if you scream, the only thing that hears you is the woods.
It's completely desolate.
What makes this story so uniquely chilling isn't just that isolation itself, but how the killer utilized it before the murders even took place. We are talking about mysterious footprints in the fresh snow, emerging from that dark tree line, walking directly up to the farm, but with absolutely no footprints ever leading back out.
Yeah, just pacing.
And reports of a phantom presence just pacing back and forth in the attic above the family as they slept. Imagine someone destroying your entire world, and instead of running into the night, they stay. They make themselves at home.
It creates a sense of claustrophobia that is just hard to shake. How does a murderer seamlessly take over a victim's life for days without anyone in the surrounding area noticing?
Right.
To answer that, we first have to explore the highly secretive, almost impenetrable ecosystem of the Gruber family themselves. Because if we are looking at the sociology of this crime, the victims weren't living this picturesque, sociable country life. They were essentially operating as a fortress.
A total fortress.
Yeah.
I want you to picture the cast of individuals living in this pressure cooker.
Yeah.
The patriarch of the family was Andreas Gruber. He was a 63-year-old man who, by all accounts, was gruff, authoritative, and fiercely protective of his property.
Very difficult man.
He lived there with his 72-year-old wife, Cecilia. Also under this roof was their 35-year-old widowed daughter, Victoria Gabriel.
And the kids.
Right. Victoria had 2 young children living there as well. A 7-year-old girl, also named Cecilia after her grandmother, and a 2-year-old toddler named Joseph. And finally, rounding out the household on the very day of the murders was a newly hired maid, 44-year-old Maria Baumgartner.
Which brings the total to 6 people. 6 people living in a space that was physically isolated, but I'd argue more importantly, socially isolated.
Oh, absolutely.
When you study victimology, you always look at a victim's relationship with their community. If you were a neighbor living a mile away in 1922, you wouldn't just, pop over to the Gruber's farm to borrow a cup of sugar or check on them if they missed church.
No way.
You would actively avoid them.
Which is such a crucial point. It's like reading an Edgar Allan Poe story layered over a rural farming community. Just isolation breeding paranoia and dark secrets. The Grubers were outcasts. And it wasn't because they were just, unfriendly. It was due to a highly scandalous and entirely documented reputation.
Yeah.
I initially thought the rumors about them were just small-town gossip, but you actually have to look at the official court records. This is vital context for why nobody came looking for them.
It is the absolute core of their isolation. In 1915, Andreas Gruber and his daughter Victoria were convicted in the Newburgh District Court for engaging in an incestuous relationship.
Which is just wild to think about being public knowledge.
Yeah, this is not internet speculation. It was a matter of public judicial record.
Yeah.
Andreas actually served a year in prison for the crime, and Victoria served a month. You have to consider the environment here. This is deeply conservative, rural, Catholic Bavaria in the early 20th century.
Right.
Conviction of that nature meant total social excommunication. The community shunned them completely.
And this scandal wasn't ancient history by the time of the murders in 1922 either. It was a dark cloud still actively hanging over the farm, especially because of the controversial, unconfirmed paternity of the youngest child, 2-year-old Joseph.
Mm-hmm.
You have this toddler running around the farm, and the entire village is whispering about who the father is.
Precisely. The social dynamics surrounding little Joseph were explosive. Victoria had actually admitted to a neighbor, a man named Lorenz Schlittenbauer, who he becomes a massive focal point later in our examination.
Oh, definitely.
She admitted to him that Joseph was conceived through her father's continuing abuse. Now, Schlittenbauer had his own complicated history with Victoria, and he initially reported Andreas to the authorities again in 1919.
Right, but he dropped it.
He did. He withdrew that complaint only to reassert it during a trial where Andreas was eventually released due to insufficient evidence. So you have a family constantly under the threat of legal action, constantly judged by their peers, and fiercely defensive against the outside world.
Which meant they were an island. If the Grubers didn't go into town for groceries for 3 or 4 days, the neighbors weren't going to form a search party.
No, they wouldn't care.
They were just going to assume the Grubers were keeping to themselves, as usual. And it's on that island where the creeping dread began to take hold months before the actual violence occurred.
The buildup is terrifying.
Let's walk through the prelude to this terror, because one of the biggest misconceptions about Hinterkaifeck is that the killer just snapped one night and broke in. This was a methodical, terrifying buildup. Let's look at the previous maid, a woman named Crescence Reiger. She had actually quit her job at the farm 6 months earlier, in September of 1921.
Her departure is an enormous behavioral red flag in the timeline of this case. When you look at her police statements, she didn't just resign for better pay elsewhere. She fled in absolute terror.
Yeah.
She was fundamentally convinced the farmstead was haunted by an ominous presence. She reported hearing constant, heavy footsteps in the attic while she was trying to sleep.
Ugh, horrifying.
She told authorities that doors would inexplicably open on their own, specifically in the dead of night. She described this persistent, suffocating feeling of being watched from the shadows.
Andreas Gruber, who seems like the kind of patriarch who just didn't tolerate any nonsense, completely dismissed her. He told her she was mentally disturbed, that she was hearing mice or the house settle.
Of course he did.
But you have to wonder, if you're sleeping in that house and you hear heavy boots dragging across the floorboards right above your ceiling, how do you just convince yourself it's the wind?
You really can't. It speaks to Andreas's profound denial or, perhaps his ego. He believed his property was his domain and he controlled everything within it. But that illusion of control started to shatter weeks before the murders because the quote-unquote ghost Crescence Reiger was so terrified of started leaving physical evidence.
Right.
This wasn't just creaking floorboards or a drafty door anymore. Things began to happen that even Andreas couldn't explain away with a wave of his hand.
Exactly. I want to emphasize the physical anomalies because they point to a level of brazen confidence from the intruder. First, Andreas finds an unfamiliar Munich newspaper on the property. Nobody in the Gruber household subscribed to this paper.
And they were out in the middle of nowhere.
Right, and he actually checked with the local postman, who confirmed he hadn't lost it, because nobody in the entire surrounding vicinity subscribed to it either. It was a physical artifact brought from the outside world, left inside their perimeter.
It's a classic psychological intrusion. And it escalated rapidly from there. Keys to the house mysteriously vanish. You can imagine the panic of losing the keys to your home when you already feel alienated from the world.
Seriously.
Then Andreas discovered that the lock on the machine shed had been tampered with and broken. There were fresh scratches on the metal, indicating someone had actively tried to pick it or force it open. The perimeter was being tested.
And then comes the detail that just makes my blood run cold. It's late March, just days before the murders. A fresh snowstorm has blanketed the region. Andreas walks out of his front door into the crisp morning air, and he sees a clear set of human tracks.
Right.
He follows them. They lead out of the dense, bordering woods, walking directly across the pristine snow and go right up to the farm's machine room. He stands there, looking at the tracks, and then he looks for the return footprints heading back into the trees.
But there are none.
There are none. The tracks only go one way, inward.
Think about the spatial reality of that moment. You are standing in the freezing cold, staring at proof that someone walked onto your property and never left.
Yeah.
Andreas actually conducted a search of the farmstead. He walked through the outbuildings, he went up into the attic, but he claimed he found no one. Now, he did mention these bizarre occurrences to his neighbors. He complained about the missing keys, the broken lock, and those footprints. One neighbor, sensing the obvious danger, actually offered to lend Andreas a gun for protection.
And Andreas refused it.
He did.
He flat out said he wasn't afraid. I really try to put myself in his shoes here, and I just cannot fathom the psychology. If you see footprints leading to your home and not away, and you already know a previous employee fled because of footsteps in the attic, why on earth do you refuse a weapon? Why do you refuse to call the local police?
It all circles back to the family's criminal history and their profound isolation. When you have served prison time for an incest conviction and your entire community views you with intense suspicion and disgust, involving the authorities is the absolute last thing you want to do.
Yeah, that makes sense.
For Andreas, the police weren't protectors. They were the people who had locked him up before. He likely believed he could handle whatever vagrant or drifter was poking around his barn. It's a tragic manifestation of rural hubris.
But the psychological tension inside that house must have been suffocating. You have a family trapped together, knowing someone might be watching them, and they are already prone to incredibly toxic dynamics. We know that the night before the murders, on March 30th, the pressure cooker finally blew. A violent, screaming row erupted inside the farmhouse.
Things got really bad.
According to what 7-year-old Cecilia later innocently told her schoolmates, her grandfather Andreas physically hit her mother, Victoria. The assault was so intense that Victoria literally fled out the door into the freezing woods to escape him.
The panic within the family was palpable. They couldn't find Victoria for hours. They were searching the property in the dark, thinking she might have succumbed to the elements or even taken her own life. Finally, as dawn approached, they found her just sitting alone on a log deep in the forest, freezing and traumatized.
It paints a horrifying picture of a family pushed to the absolute breaking point. They are terrified of the unseen watcher outside, and they are violently turning on each other on the inside. And it was exactly into this claustrophobic nightmare that Maria Baumgartner, the new maid, arrived. Her sister dropped her off on the afternoon of Friday, March 31st, 1922.
It is one of the most tragic timings in criminal history. It was her very first day on the job. She unpacked her meager belongings, entirely unaware of the footprints, the attic noises, or the violence from the night before. And within hours of her arrival, the systemic slaughter of the entire household began.
Let's walk through the murders, because the clinical, brutal efficiency of what happened that Friday evening completely rules out a frenzied, chaotic break-in. Based on the autopsy reports and crime scene analysis, investigators put together a timeline that is just staggering in its calculation. The killer didn't kick down the front door while everyone was eating dinner. Instead, they managed to lure 4 of the family members out of the main house and into the barn, one by one.
Think about the logistical control required to pull that off. The prevailing behavioral theory, and the one that makes the most sense given the layout of the farm, is that the killer went into the barn and intentionally disturbed the livestock.
Right.
In a farming environment, the animals are your livelihood. If the cows are restless or the pigs are making noise, you don't wait until morning to check on them. You go immediately. The killer used the noise of the restless animals as bait, drawing the family members out of the safety of the house to investigate individually in the dark.
I always try to imagine the sheer terror of being the second or third person to walk out there. Andreas goes out with a lantern, and he doesn't come back. So his wife, Cecilia, goes out to see what's taking him so long. She doesn't come back.
No.
Then Victoria goes.
Yeah.
Then the 7-year-old girl. Once they stepped through the adjoining stable and crossed the threshold into the main barn area, the killer struck from the shadows.
Oh.
And we have to talk about the murder weapon, because this wasn't a military rifle or a specialized assassin's blade. They were slaughtered with a mattock.
Right. A mattock is a heavy, cumbersome farming tool. If you aren't familiar with it, imagine a tool similar to a pickaxe, but with a stout head combining an axe blade on one side and an adze or pick on the other.
Right, so very heavy.
It is designed for breaking up hard, compacted soil or chopping through thick tree roots. It requires significant upper body strength to swing effectively, especially in the enclosed, dim space of a barn.
And the most disturbing part is where that mattock came from. The farmhand, George Siegel, later identified the weapon for the police. He knew it intimately because he had actually watched Andreas Gruber carve the wooden handle himself.
Wow.
It was their own tool, kept in their own tool shed. The killer didn't even bring a weapon to the farm. They simply acquired the family's own implement and used it against them.
Which is a massive indicator of the killer's operational comfort. They didn't strike in a panic with whatever they had in their pocket. They planned the assault, selected a weapon of opportunity from the environment, and wielded it with terrifying, sustained force. The autopsy details, performed by court physician Johann Baptist Amler, outline a level of violence that goes far beyond simply incapacitating a victim. It was absolute overkill.
Yeah, I want to be careful not to just list gory details for the sake of it, but understanding the specific injuries is vital to profiling the killer's state of mind. Victoria and her mother, the elder Cecilia, didn't just suffer blunt force trauma. They showed distinct signs of manual strangulation. Now, if I'm holding a heavy axe-like weapon, why would I drop it or use my free hand to physically choke the life out of someone?
Well, in criminal profiling, strangulation is considered a highly intimate, intensely personal method of killing. It requires you to be physically close to the victim, looking into their eyes, feeling their struggle, and exerting prolonged, hands-on dominance. The fact that the killer utilized blunt force trauma with a mattock smashing the right half of Andreas' face completely, cracking the elder Cecilia's skull with 7 distinct blows, and inflicting 9 star-shaped wounds to Victoria's head, but also took the time to strangle the women, suggests a deeply rooted rage. This was not a thief who hit them to escape. This was someone who wanted to obliterate them.
Obliterate is the exact right word. After massacring 4 people, the killer took their broken bodies and methodically stacked them in a corner of the barn, pulling a heavy wooden door over them and covering the pile with hay. But the most gut-wrenching detail of the entire autopsy report, the thing that stays with you long after you stop reading the case file, is what they discovered about the 7-year-old girl, Cecilia.
It is the most harrowing aspect of the tragedy. The physical and physiological evidence showed that young Cecilia did not die instantly from the strikes.
God, it's just awful.
She survived the initial brutal assault. We know from the blood pooling and the state of rigor mortis that she lived for several hours lying in the hay, trapped next to the bludgeoned, stacked bodies of her mother and her grandparents.
Put yourself in that freezing, dark barn. You were 7 years old, you were critically injured, bleeding out in the hay, and you were surrounded by the corpses of your family. The physiological shock and psychological trauma were so profound that in her final hours, the autopsy revealed she had literally torn her own hair out in clumps.
Yeah.
When they found her, she had thick tufts of her own hair gripped tightly in her cramped right hand. It is an unimaginable level of suffering.
The physical shock response in extreme trauma can manifest in self-mutilation as the brain tries to process the agonizing pain. While she was bleeding out in that barn, the killer wasn't fleeing. The killer picked up that bloody mattock, walked out of the barn, crossed the courtyard, and moved into the main living quarters to finish the systematic eradication of the household.
Inside the house, they found the new maid, Maria Baumgartner, in her small bedchamber. She was killed by powerful crosswise blows to the head. Given that she was found fully clothed, she may have just been unpacking her bags or getting ready for bed on her very first night, completely unaware of the massacre happening 50 feet away.
So tragic.
And then the killer walked into Victoria's bedroom, where 2-year-old Joseph was sleeping in his bassinet. He was killed by a single catastrophic blow to the face that completely destroyed the protective hood of the stroller.
And here's where the behavioral psychology of the crime scene takes a very bizarre, contradictory turn. After utilizing immense force to crush a toddler, the killer stopped, took a piece of clothing, a skirt, and carefully draped it over the bassinet, covering the child's ruined body. They also took the time to partially cover the maid's body with a duvet.
That gesture always trips me up. You just committed an act of unspeakable savagery and then you tucked the victims in. What does that tell us about the killer's mindset?
In forensic psychology, covering a victim's face or body post-mortem is often interpreted as an act of quote-unquote undoing or a manifestation of subconscious remorse. It is incredibly common in cases where the killer has a pre-existing personal connection to the victim.
Ah, I see.
It suggests a psychological inability to look at the destruction they've caused. They need to depersonalize the corpse. But what makes Hinterkaifeck so maddening is that this small, almost gentle gesture of domestic care is instantly contradicted by what the killer did next.
Right, because this brings us to the core mystery, the absolute most disturbing fact of this entire century-old case. After slaughtering 6 people, including a toddler, the killer didn't rifle through the jewelry drawers, grab the cash box, and run off into the forest. Vast sums of gold and cash were left completely untouched in plain sight.
Right there.
There were over 700 gold marks that Victoria had recently acquired, just sitting there in the house. If you were a desperate drifter, you take the money. This wasn't a robbery. It was a targeted, intensely personal execution.
And the evidence of the post-murder activity over the next few days is what elevates this from a tragic rural mass murder to a legendary, almost mythical mystery. For 3, possibly 4 days, the killer simply lived in the farmhouse alongside the 6 corpses.
Imagine the sheer audacity.
Mm.
They didn't hide in a corner shivering in fear of being caught. They went about a domestic routine. They fed the cattle in the barn, the very same barn where 4 bodies were stacked under a door.
Mm-hmm.
They milked the cows. They went into the Gruber's pantry, cut fresh meat from the winter supply, and systematically ate the family's entire supply of bread. They slept in the beds. They kept the fires burning in the oven so the house stayed warm.
We aren't just guessing this based on a few crumbs either. We have multiple sworn witness accounts corroborating this bizarre post-murder activity. On April 1st, the day immediately following the Friday night murders, 2 coffee sellers named Hans and Edward Sharofsky arrived at the farm to take a routine order. They found the place completely silent, which was odd, but they noted that the heavy gate to the machine room was standing wide open, suggesting someone was actively moving around the property.
And later that night, it gets even more surreal. An artisan named Michael Pluckel was walking past the farm. It was dark, and he noticed thick smoke billowing from the bakehouse oven chimney. He specifically noted that the smoke had a revolting, acrid smell, like burning rags or burning hair.
Detail is so weird.
It has led to endless debate over the past century about what the killer was actually tossing into the fire to destroy evidence. But the craziest part of Pluckel's testimony is that as he was standing there looking at the strange smoke, the front door of the farmhouse opened.
An unidentified man stepped out of the house. Now remember, 6 people are dead inside. This man holds up a pocket lantern, points it directly at Pluckel, and shines the bright beam right into his eyes, intentionally blinding him so Pluckel couldn't make out his facial features.
Wow.
The man didn't say a word. He just stood there, blinding the witness until Pluckel felt unnerved and walked away.
It is the ultimate flex of territorial dominance. Like, this is my house now, keep walking. And the brazen activity continued for days. Fast forward to April 4th, the very day the bodies are finally discovered. A local mechanic named Albert Hoffner arrives at the farmstead to repair a motorized engine.
Right, he was there for a while.
He is there working on this noisy machine for 4.5 hours. During that time, he hears the family dog barking frantically inside the locked barn. Hoffner doesn't see anyone, so he just assumes the family is out in the fields, does his mechanical work, and packs up his tools. But as he is leaving the property, he notices a massive change. The barn door, which had been locked when he arrived, is now open, and the dog, which had been barking inside, has been let out and securely tied to a post outside.
It is an incredible detail to analyze. While Hoffner is standing in the courtyard fixing an engine, the killer is literally creeping around the property just out of sight, actively moving the dog so the mechanic won't get curious, walk into the barn, and find the bodies under the hay.
It's unbelievable.
The sheer nerve it takes to manage a crime scene while a civilian is standing 50 feet away is astounding. It makes you realize how dangerously comfortable and adapted the perpetrator was in that specific environment.
Exactly. It implies a proprietary attitude toward the farm. I mean, think about it. This person knew exactly how to care for that specific livestock. They knew where the animal feed was stored, they knew where the pantry was, where the bread was kept, and they felt completely entitled to consume the family's resources. A random serial killer off a train doesn't know how to milk a Bavarian cow or care enough to feed a barking dog.
So how does the facade finally crumble? It happens later that same afternoon, April 4th. Albert Hoffner, the mechanic, finishes up and heads back into the local village. He runs into Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the neighbor we mentioned earlier who had the complicated history with Victoria. Hoffner casually mentions that the Gruber farm seemed deserted, but he noticed the dog had been moved and tied up. Now, Schlittenbauer already knew something was wrong. He knew the intensely devout Grubers hadn't been seen at church on Sunday, and he knew the young girl, Cecilia, had uncharacteristically missed several days of school. Hearing about the dog is the tipping point. Schlittenbauer decides to investigate. He recruits 2 other neighbors, Michael Paul and Jakob Sigel, and the 3 men hike up to Hinterkaifeck.
When they arrive, the place is dead silent. The property is locked up tight. They knock, they call out, nothing. Finally, they have to physically break through a sturdy gate just to force their way into the barn. And it is there, in the dim, freezing light of the barn, that they start poking around. They uncover the hay, lift the heavy wooden door, and find the stacked, mutilated bodies of Andrea, Cecilia, Victoria, and the young girl.
It is a moment of pure, visceral horror. But what happens next is where the timeline of the investigation immediately goes completely off the rails, setting the stage for a century of unsolved mystery. Because after finding 4 brutally murdered bodies in a blood-soaked barn, Lorenz Schlittenbauer does not immediately run to the nearest town to call the police.
No, he doesn't. According to the sworn testimonies of the other 2 men, Paul and Sigel, Schlittenbauer mysteriously produces a key.
A key to the house.
Yes, he walks over to the front door of the main house, unlocks it without any issue, and walks inside, alone, while a mass murderer could potentially still be hiding in the next room.
His actions in those crucial minutes were incredibly suspicious and violated every protocol of preserving a scene, even by 1922 standards. When Paul and Sigel frantically asked him why he would risk entering the dark house alone, Schlittenbauer claimed he was desperately looking for his son, referring to the 2-year-old Joseph, whose paternity he had legally disputed but clearly felt a strong connection to. He goes inside, discovers the bludgeoned bodies of the maid and the toddler, and in the process, he physically moves the bodies around.
He moves the bodies. I cannot stress enough what an investigator's nightmare this is.
Yeah.
You have a prime suspect actively rearranging the physical evidence of a mass murder before the police are even notified. And when the official police finally do arrive, the situation gets infinitely worse. Inspector George Ryan Gruber is dispatched from the Munich Police Department, which is a significant distance away. By the time Ryan Gruber and his detectives actually get to Hinterkaifeck the next day, the crime scene hasn't just been contaminated, it has been utterly obliterated.
It was a disastrous, almost comical failure of police response. You have to understand the sociological reality of a small rural community in Weimar-era Germany. News of a massacre doesn't just spread, it detonates like a bomb. Before the Munich detectives could set up any kind of perimeter or secure the property, dozens of local townsfolk, farmers, and morbidly curious onlookers had descended upon the farmstead. We are talking about crowds of people trampling through the snow, completely destroying any chance of tracking the killer's exit footprints.
It is mind-boggling to read the reports. The crime scene essentially became a morbid tourist attraction. Imagine trying to solve a jigsaw puzzle while 50 strangers are actively taking pieces out of the box, eating sandwiches over the board, and moving the pieces around.
That's a great analogy.
Because that is literally what happened. The police arrived to find that locals had gone into the farmhouse kitchen and actually cooked themselves meals using the Gruber's food, mere feet from where Maria Baumgartner lay dead in her bed.
It was a total collapse of forensic integrity. And the official police work, frankly, wasn't much better. Court physician Johann Baptist Aumler essentially performed the autopsies right there on the spot, inside the freezing barn, in front of onlookers. They didn't systematically take fingerprints from the scene. Now, to provide historical fairness, fingerprinting was still an emerging science in 1922, especially in rural outposts, but it was known and utilized by major departments like Munich. The failure to dust for prints on the mattock or the door handles was a fatal error. And then, in one of the most bizarre, almost gothic twists of early forensic history, the authorities decided to remove the skulls of all 6 victims.
Yes, the bodies were buried in the local cemetery without their heads. The skulls were detached, boxed up, and sent to Munich for what was supposed to be, quote-unquote, further examination. But I want to explore why they did this because it sounds insane to modern ears. Rather than utilizing rigorous forensic pathology, the authorities eventually handed these 6 skulls over to clairvoyants.
It's hard to believe.
They literally gave the victims' heads to psychics, hoping someone could glean some supernatural spiritual insight into the killer's identity by touching the bone.
To understand how that could possibly happen, you have to look at the cultural trauma of post-World War I Germany. The country was reeling from mass death, hyperinflation, and a totally collapsed social order. When a society experiences trauma on that scale, there is a massive cultural boom in spiritualism, the occult, and a desperate desire to communicate with the dead. This spiritual desperation actually permeated official police work at the time. They were grasping at straws.
Well, spoiler alert, the psychics did not solve the case. And to add profound insult to injury, those skulls were stored in a government building in Munich for 2 decades, until they were entirely destroyed during the Allied bombings in World War II. They are completely lost to history.
Such a shame.
We can't run modern DNA testing. We can't do modern 3D skull reconstruction. The evidence is just gone. And the farm itself. Hinterkaifeck was demolished in 1923, less than a year after the murders. The locals tore it down to erase the stigma from the land. During the demolition, they actually found the bloody murder weapon, the mattock, hidden under the floorboards in the attic, proving the killer had retreated up there after the slaughter. But the physical reality of the farm was wiped off the map forever.
Because the 1922 investigation was so thoroughly compromised from day one, and because the physical evidence was literally destroyed or eaten by neighbors, it left behind a massive, gaping void of conclusive facts. And as we know in the world of true crime, when official authorities leave a vacuum, the public rushes in to fill it.
Oh, absolutely. Amateur sleuths, historians, and internet communities have spent a century dissecting every rumor, every misfiled police report, and every deathbed confession. Because there is no DNA to give us a definitive answer, we are left with behavioral theories. Let's walk through how this case has been interpreted culturally, and let's critically evaluate the prime suspects that historians have debated endlessly.
The most enduring narrative, and the one that truly captures the public imagination, is what we call the stranger in the attic theory. It's the terrifying idea that a faceless vagrant, a transient drifter, crept into the farmstead, lived secretly in the rafters through the freezing winter, survived by sneaking down for scraps, and then finally descended to slaughter the family.
But I want to push back on that theory heavily. As terrifying as the horror movie Monster in the Attic is, I think we cling to it because it's comforting. It is psychologically safer to believe that monsters are faceless strangers from the woods, but statistically, family annihilations are almost always committed by someone deeply entrenched in the family's orbit.
Exactly.
Does the vagrant theory really hold water when you look at the evidence? If you are a starving drifter hiding in an attic, you don't know exactly how to care for specific livestock. You don't know where the animal feed is kept. And most importantly, you do not actively ignore a fortune in cash sitting on the table. A desperate transient taking the time to milk cows but leaving behind 700 gold marks makes absolutely zero sense to me.
Your skepticism is entirely warranted, and it aligns precisely with how modern forensic profilers view the case. The behavioral evidence points overwhelmingly to someone with local knowledge and a personal grievance. Let's evaluate the suspect who fits that profile perfectly, the man who has shadowed this case from the very moment the bodies were found. The neighbor, Lorenz Schlittenbauer.
Okay, let's unpack Schlittenbauer, because his behavior walks a very fine, razor-sharp line between a shocked, pragmatic neighbor and a guilty, manipulative perpetrator. We know his motive. He had a previous romantic, intimate relationship with Victoria. We know she had recently humiliated him by suing him for alimony, publicly claiming he was the father of 2-year-old Joseph, a claim that would ruin his standing in the Catholic community.
The motive for Schlittenbauer is glaring. Extreme financial strain from the impending alimony suit, intense public embarrassment, and a deep-seated toxic personal entanglement with a highly dysfunctional family. But it's his behavior upon discovering the bodies that makes him the prime suspect. As we discussed, he mysteriously had a key to the house, a key that Andreas Gruber had reported missing just days before the murders.
Right.
He unlocked the door and went inside alone, risking his own life if a killer was present. He showed an inexplicable lack of shock or revulsion upon finding the bloody corpses of people he knew intimately.
I initially thought Schlittenbauer moving the bodies was a definitive smoking gun for his guilt. But when you look at the rural customs of the era, isn't there an argument to be made that he was just a pragmatic farmer? If you find people attacked, your first instinct in 1922 isn't preserve the crime scene for DNA swabbing.
No, definitely not.
Your first instinct is, are any of them still breathing? Can I save the boy? Is it possible his lack of revulsion was just the hardened reality of a farmer used to slaughtering animals and dealing with harsh life?
That is the exact defense his advocates use, and it is a valid historical perspective. Moving bodies to check for signs of life is a natural human instinct. However, his suspicious behavior didn't end in 1922. Years later, in 1925, official police case files note that Schlittenbauer was caught wandering around the demolished ruins of Hinterkaifeck. When authorities approached him and asked what he was doing poking around the empty field, he made a deeply unsettling, highly specific comment.
I remember this.
He told the police that the killer's attempt to bury the family's remains under the hay in the barn had been hindered because the ground was frozen solid.
Which is a mind-blowing thing to say. That is a highly specific, intimate detail about the physical condition of the soil inside the barn at the exact time of the murders. How would he know the killer tried to dig a grave and failed, unless he was the one holding the shovel?
Defenders of Schlittenbauer argue that as a neighboring farmer who lived just down the road, he obviously knew the condition of the soil in late March. He knew the ground was frozen everywhere.
Sure.
But the specificity of attributing that frozen ground to the killer's motives is what haunts investigators. Furthermore, Schlittenbauer lived his entire life under this massive cloud of suspicion. Before his death in 1941, he actually conducted and won several civil lawsuits for slander against local villagers in the pub who publicly called him the murderer of Hinterkaifeck. He fought back legally, maintaining his innocence to his dying breath.
He definitely weaponized the legal system to silence his critics. But if it wasn't the bitter neighbor, we have to look at the other extreme theory, the dead husband. This is the wild, almost cinematic theory that Victoria's husband, Carl Gabriel, didn't actually die in the muddy trenches of World War I. The theory suggests he survived the war, perhaps suffered amnesia or deserted, came back home under an alias, discovered the horrific incestuous relationship between his wife and her father, and exacted a brutal, righteous revenge against the whole family.
It is a theory fueled heavily by the chaos and trauma of post-war Europe. After World War II, several German prisoners of war returning from Soviet captivity claimed they had been sent home early by a mysterious German-speaking Soviet officer. According to these rumors, this officer explicitly confessed to them that he was the Hinterkaifeck murderer.
Wow.
Many people immediately speculated this officer was a surviving Carl Gabriel who had fled to Russia after the killings.
But when you actually dig into the military records, is there any factual proof that he survived 1914? People went missing in the trenches all the time.
There is very little proof of his survival and substantial proof of his death. In fact, the authorities took this theory seriously enough to interview fellow soldiers who served directly alongside Gabriel. Specifically, two men named Joseph Bischler and Nicholas Haas steadfastly verified under oath that they saw Carl Gabriel killed instantly by a mine shell explosion at the Battle of Arras in December 1914.
Okay, so pretty definitive.
Very. They reported seeing his lifeless body in the trench, specifically noting his skull was slightly split open by the shrapnel, making him instantly, tragically recognizable in death. Despite the persistent murmurs of a vengeful ghost returning from the front lines, the military confirmation of his death is historically quite strong.
It seems like people just wanted a poetic resolution. A wronged soldier returning to cleanse the farm of its sins is a much better story than a neighbor killing a toddler over alimony money. Okay, so if the dead husband is a ghost story, what about the serial killer theory? I know the renowned baseball statistician and true crime author Bill James proposed a fascinating theory connecting Hinterkaifeck to a notorious American killer.
Yes, in his book The Man from the Train, Bill James hypothesizes that a German migrant named Paul Mueller was responsible for Hinterkaifeck. Mueller was the prime suspect in an 1898 family annihilation in Massachusetts, and is theorized by James to have traveled across the United States by hopping freight trains, committing dozens of similar brutal axe murders along the rail lines. Most notably, Mueller is the prime suspect for the infamous Villisca axe murders in Iowa, where an entire family was bludgeoned in their sleep.
The behavioral similarities between Villisca and Hinterkaifeck are definitely striking. You have the total slaughter of isolated families. You have the specific use of the blunt edge of farm tools like an axe or a mattock rather than the sharp blade. You have the killer taking the time to move and stack the victims' bodies. You have the bizarre psychological quirk of covering the mirrors or draping clothes over the faces of the victims. And in both cases, you have the total absence of robbery as a motive. The killer leaves the money and just melts away.
It is a compelling exercise in pattern analysis. James suggests that Mueller fled the United States around 1912 as investigators finally started connecting his crimes and noticing his rail writing patterns. James posits that Mueller could have returned to his native Germany, laid low during World War I, and then struck again at Hinterkaifeck in 1922.
Interesting.
However, as James himself intellectually admits, it is entirely circumstantial speculation. There is zero documentary evidence, no ship manifests, no arrest records, no witness sightings placing Paul Mueller anywhere near Bavaria in 1922.
It's a fascinating what if, but it lacks the local intimacy the crime scene demands. Mueller wouldn't know how to navigate the social dynamics of the Gruber's isolation or know the layout of the barn. Which brings us back to local suspects. The police interviewed over 100 people in the surrounding villages over the decades, including local petty thieves and members of paramilitary groups roaming the countryside.
Right, like the Thaler brothers.
Yeah, Joseph and Andreas. The former maid, Cretense Reiger, actually told police that Joseph Thaler had knocked on her window at night a year before the murders, asking highly specific, suspicious questions about where the family slept and noting that they had a lot of gold hoarded inside. She even saw him staring up at the roof of the machine room, casing the property.
And then there were the Gump brothers, Adolf and Anton. They had direct ties to the Freikorps Oberland, which was a far-right, heavily armed paramilitary group formed by disbanded soldiers after WWI. These groups operated with extreme violence and impunity.
Wow.
The Gump brothers were already implicated in the brutal murder of 9 peasants in Silesia. In 1951, their own sister made a dramatic deathbed confession, claiming Adolf and Anton committed the Hinterkaifeck massacres. Anton was actually arrested based on this confession, but he was eventually released due to a total lack of concrete physical proof, and Adolf had already died during WWII.
So many deathbed confessions, so many whispered rumors in taverns, but no definitive physical link. It's exactly why this case is so widely discussed and debated today. You can get entirely lost in the weeds of these translated century-old police reports. Because the official investigation failed so spectacularly, modern sleuths are utilizing new techniques to try and make sense of the old data. I was looking at a specific, highly detailed historical true crime thread on Reddit, where an art professor whose work deals specifically in forensic aesthetics decided to tackle the case not by reading witness statements, but by analyzing the physical space. They created an incredibly precise 1:12 scale model of the entire Hinterkaifeck farmstead.
That project is a brilliant exercise in spatial forensics. It heavily echoes the nutshell studies of unexplained death created by Francis Lesnar Lee in the 1940s, which fundamentally revolutionized how detectives analyze crime scenes.
Oh, yeah.
By taking flat, confusing, century-old floor plans, property deeds, and probate records, and building them into a tangible, three-dimensional physical model, you suddenly begin to understand the physical and acoustic reality of the victim's daily environment.
And what this professor's physical model revealed is staggering. When you look at the 3D layout of the farm, you realize just how cramped and deeply interconnected the entire property was.
Mm-hmm.
In modern terms, we think of a barn as a separate building sitting across a wide field.
Mm.
But at Hinterkaifeck, the barn was physically attached to the main house via the animal stable.
Mm-hmm.
You could literally walk from the hayloft in the barn, through the cow pens, and open a door directly into the family's living quarters without ever stepping a foot outside into the courtyard.
It was a single, continuous structure, and the most crucial architectural revelation from that 3D model is the reality of the attic. The model visibly highlights that the attic spanning the entire length of this massive structure had absolutely no interior walls. There were no firewalls, no segmented rooms, no barriers of any kind from the barn all the way to the bedrooms.
None. Meaning a killer could climb a ladder in the barn, enter the attic space, walk seamlessly across the entire length of the structure, and position themselves directly above the ceiling of the family's bedrooms in the main house. Because there was no modern insulation, just raw wooden floorboards, The attic acted as a giant acoustic chamber.
Exactly.
The killer could lay there in the dark and hear every whisper, every argument, and every footstep from the family below. It essentially turned the house into a giant surveillance tool for the murderer. It takes the stranger in the attic theory from a spooky campfire tale to a very terrifying logistical reality.
It perfectly demonstrates how the specific architecture of Hinterkaifeck actively facilitated the crime. The killer utilized the building itself as an accomplice. The case's intense spatial and psychological claustrophobia is exactly why it has inspired so much modern media and literature in Europe.
I see why.
The best-selling German novel Tanud by Andrea Maria Schenkel is a brilliantly fictionalized account of the murders that sold over 1 million copies and was later adapted into a feature film. The case was also featured prominently in the Amazon television series Lore. The narrative of an isolated family being methodically hunted from within the walls of their own fortress taps into a primal, universal fear.
Right. It's the ultimate violation of sanctuary. Your home is supposed to be the one place you are safe from the world, and here the danger was baked into the floorboards. So if we strip away the urban legends, ignore the psychic skull readings, and look at this strictly through the lens of modern forensic science, spatial reality, and behavioral profiling, what can we actually conclude today? Is it truly unsolvable?
Well, in 2007, an official, rigorous review was conducted by 15 elite students from the Fürstenfeldbruck Police Academy in Germany. They were tasked with analyzing all the surviving, fragmented evidence using modern criminal investigative techniques that obviously didn't exist in 1922. Things like advanced behavioral profiling, victimology, digital crime scene reconstruction, and precise timeline analysis.
And after applying all that modern methodology, what was their official verdict?
Officially and legally, they determined that the case is unsolvable. The tragic lack of professional forensic protocols in 1922, the failure to take fingerprints, the destruction of the skulls in the bombings, and the simple reality that all potential suspects and witnesses are long dead means that no court of law could ever render a conviction. Legally, the file must remain open.
But when you read the fine print of their report, there is a massive, incredibly chilling caveat, isn't there?
There is. While they couldn't legally declare the case solved, all 15 police academy students, working independently through the data, evaluated the surviving circumstantial and behavioral evidence and arrived at a unanimous conclusion. They all agreed on the exact same prime suspect. They completely aligned on who they believe committed the murders.
They figured it out, but they adamantly refused to publish the killer's name in their final report. Why go through all that work just to keep it a secret?
It comes down to strict German privacy laws and ethical standards regarding the defamation of the dead. Out of respect for the suspect's living descendants, people who had absolutely nothing to do with the crime committed a century ago, they withheld the actual name.
That makes sense.
However, based on their detailed analysis, which heavily emphasized the necessity of local geographic knowledge, deep personal motive, and the specific timeline of how the investigation was derailed, it is overwhelmingly implied within the structure of their report that their suspect was someone strictly local, someone who was interrogated early on, but perhaps not treated as a primary threat by the overwhelmed original detectives.
Which points a massive neon arrow directly at Lorenz Schlittenbauer, or perhaps another closely intertwined neighbor. It completely undercuts the romanticized theory of the American serial killer or the faceless drifter. But if it was a neighbor, if it was someone like Schlittenbauer who had his own farm, his own family, and his own life just down the road, I have to ask, why does the post-murder activity continue to unsettle us so deeply? What is the psychological explanation for a local killer taking the time to make a sandwich, light the oven, and feed the dog, while 6 people he just butchered lie dead 50 feet away?
If we connect this to the broader spectrum of criminal psychology, the post-murder activity tells us definitively that the killer was not in a frenzied panic after the adrenaline wore off. A disorganized killer, or a transient thief who is suddenly caught off guard, strikes in sheer chaos, drops the weapon, and flees in absolute terror. The act of staying behind, purposefully doing the daily agricultural chores, tending to the cattle so they don't starve, and lighting the oven to stay warm shows a chilling, almost psychopathic level of comfort and ownership. It is a profound assertion of dominance. They didn't just end the Grubers' lives, they consumed their existence.
They literally stepped into their shoes and took over the farm.
Exactly. It suggests a practical, cold domesticity that is incredibly rare in the annals of criminal history. It points to someone who knew the daily routine of the farm so intimately that they could perfectly replicate it. They knew the dog wouldn't attack them because the dog knew their scent. They knew exactly where the winter bread was stored in the pantry.
Yeah.
If the killer was someone local like Schlittenbauer, staying at the farm intermittently over those 3 or 4 days might have been a highly calculated way to maintain the illusion of normalcy from the outside. By keeping the smoke coming out of the chimney and the cows milked, he delayed the discovery of the bodies while he figured out his alibi and his next move.
So when you synthesize all the behavioral evidence, the picture becomes horrifyingly clear. The absolute overkill, cracking skulls, smashing faces, the manual strangulation of the women indicating a pathological need for hands-on, violent control, the targeted, brutal violence against the toddler whose very existence and paternity was the subject of a bitter public dispute. All of this screams a crime of passion, resentment, and deep-seated personal rage. It wasn't a random robbery by a passing vagrant who just happened to find an unlocked door.
The physical and psychological evidence strongly, undeniably, leans toward a localized, highly personal annihilation. The killer didn't bring a weapon. They utilized the family's own tool. They manipulated the architectural environment against the victims, using the attic as a staging ground. And then, most horrifyingly, they seamlessly absorbed the victim's daily routine.
It's just terrifying to contemplate. The legacy of Hinterkaifeck isn't just the sheer brutality of a heavy mattock swinging in the dark. It's the terrifying silence of a remote farmstead where the monster wasn't hiding out in the snowy woods. He wasn't some unknown boogeyman migrating off a freight train. He was a familiar face. He was sitting at their kitchen table. He was eating their food. He was walking their dog.
It forces us to confront a very dark reality about human nature, that the most profound threats often come from within our immediate proximity. The true horror of Hinterkaifeck is the intimacy of the violence. It was perpetrated by someone who knew their routines, knew their vulnerabilities, and knew exactly how isolated they truly were.
It forces you to look at your own home differently, doesn't it? We lock our doors at night, we turn on the porch lights, and we set the alarms to keep the danger out. But the lingering tragedy of Hinterkaifeck is the realization that sometimes the danger might already be inside, quietly waiting in the dark above you.
A haunting reminder that the walls we build to protect ourselves from the outside world can just as easily become the traps that confine us with the monsters inside.
Next time, we revisit the Sodder children mystery, exploring newly analyzed photographs, decades of reported sightings, and the enduring question of whether 5 children truly died in a Christmas Eve fire.